Hi everyone. Today we're diving into a market structure that you probably interact with every single day. Monopolistic competition. Think about your local restaurants, clothing stores, or supermarkets. These aren't quite monopolies, but they aren't perfectly competitive either. They lie somewhere in between. Monopolistic competition is a market characterized by a large number of firms, no barriers to entry or exit, and, most importantly, product differentiation. This means firms try to make their products different through quality, location, branding, or some other way that will give them a competitive advantage over other firms. In this way, each firm is like a mini monopoly because they are the single seller of their unique product. Think about it. Apple is the only company that sells iPhones, so they have a monopoly on iPhones. Nike is the only company that sells Nike shoes, so they have a monopoly on Nikes. But the problem is all of these products have very close substitutes, and that's a big difference between a true monopoly. The monopolist sells a product with no close substitutes, so consumers don't have much of a choice. Either they buy from the monopolist or they don't get the product. In monopolistically competitive markets, because there are close substitutes, consumers have other options, which gives the firms much less market power. Therefore, the demand for products in a monopolistically competitive market will be relatively elastic. Hopefully, you still remember about price elasticity of demand. A perfectly elastic demand curve will be a horizontal line, and a perfectly inelastic demand curve will be a vertical line. In other words, the flatter the curve, the more elastic it is, and the steeper the curve, the more inelastic it is. Now let's remember the demand curve for a perfectly competitive market. It's a horizontal line. That's because the demand is perfectly elastic since all the firms are selling identical products and there are many sellers. If one seller raises their price even just a little, customers will go elsewhere because the products are exactly the same. This means the firms are price takers and have no market power. However, the demand curve for a monopoly will be much steeper because they have more market power and the consumers have less options. But it's important to note that even though a monopoly might have a lot of market power, the demand curve will always be downward sloping and will never be perfectly inelastic. That's because even though, yes, there are no substitutes, the consumer still has the choice not to buy. For example, electricity doesn't have a substitute, but if the electrical company in your city raised prices so high that people could no longer afford it, people would need to reduce their consumption or maybe even go without electricity completely. So the demand curve for a monopoly may be very steep, but it will never be completely vertical. And then the demand curve for a monopolistically competitive firm is going to be somewhere in between monopoly and perfect competition. But how steep or flat the curve is depends on what's called price and non-price competition. Price competition, as you can guess from the name, is simply lowering the price of a product to try to attract customers away from competitors. Non-price competition is basically anything else that will attract customers other than price. This usually comes in the form of product differentiation and marketing. Monopolistically competitive firms compete with one another using both price and non-price competition to try to gain market share and thus market power. Research and development is very important in monopolistic competition in order to differentiate a product to somehow be superior to the competition. And sometimes the product doesn't need to be actually superior, but only needs a perceived superiority, which can be done through effective marketing. If done successfully, the demand curve will be more inelastic and the firm can get away with charging higher prices without losing a significant amount of customers. If you think of any company that is considered an industry leader, they probably charge a higher price than their competitors. Apple is famous for their brand loyalty of their customers, which means their demand curve is going to be much steeper than others because their customers will continue buying Apple products even if the price increases. Firms that are not successful with non-price competition have to rely on price competition. They simply keep their prices low in order to stay competitive. This then makes their demand curve flatter since customers do not perceive their product as superior. This makes it a bit tricky for firms using price competition, but there are famous brands that have very successfully positioned themselves as the low-price alternative for budget-conscious consumers. Costco and IKEA are two examples that are very huge multinational corporations, but their success only comes from selling cheap products. If they raise their prices, they probably wouldn't last very long. Okay, now let's talk profit maximization. So, just like all the other market structures, firms maximize their profits at the output quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And the diagrams for monopolistic competition are very similar to the ones for a monopoly. The only difference is that the demand curve is flatter since demand is more elastic for monopolistic competition, but everything else is the same. So if the price is higher than average cost at the profit-maximizing output quantity, then the firm earns abnormal profit, which again is any profit above zero. If the price equals average cost, then that means the firm is spending as much money as they are making, so this means a profit of zero, which we call a normal profit in economics. And if the price is lower than the average cost, the firm is spending more than it's making, and this is a loss. And all that is in the short run. Now we need to consider the long run. Remember that in a perfectly competitive market, because of the low barriers to entry, abnormal profits will attract new firms into the industry, and losses will cause firms to exit the industry. In a monopoly, because of the extremely high barriers to entry, this doesn't happen, so you don't even need to worry about the long run for monopolies. In a monopolistically competitive market, however, there are also low barriers to entry, meaning it operates more like a perfectly competitive market. Abnormal profit will attract new firms to enter, and losses will mean some firms will exit. This means that in the long run, all firms in the market will earn zero profit, which remember is a normal economic profit. However, it's important to note that even though the monopolistic competition equilibrium ends up being the same as perfect competition, there is a difference in how it happens. Remember that in a perfectly competitive industry, the demand is constant at the price level, and all products are identical. So when a new firm enters the market, this doesn't change the demand for the product, but instead only increases the supply. In a monopolistically competitive market, however, the products are differentiated but have close substitutes. When new firms enter the market, it doesn't increase supply since all the products are different, but it would change the demand for each individual product since the customer now has more options to choose from. So demand for a product will decrease as more firms enter the market and vice versa. But like I said, the end result is the same. Returning the market to equilibrium, meaning that in the long run, all firms earn zero profit. Okay, but does a monopolistically competitive market achieve allocative efficiency? The quick answer is no. Remember that only a perfectly competitive market achieves allocative efficiency. All the others result in market failure to some degree. Let's talk about why that is. Remember that allocative efficiency occurs when marginal benefits are equal to marginal costs. And also remember that the demand curve is a benefits curve. So right away, you can look at the diagram and see that at the profit-maximizing output level, which is the level that the firm will produce at, the marginal cost is always lower than the demand curve. This indicates there is an under-allocation of resources going to the production of that good. Society values it more and would like to have more units produced. Since the market isn't doing what's best for society, that's market failure. However, it's a bit more complicated than that. Some economists argue that product differentiation makes up for the inefficiencies. Remember that in a perfectly competitive market, firms sell identical products, so none of them try to improve their product to make it better than their competitors. But as we learned, in monopolistically competitive markets, firms spend a lot of time and money on trying to improve their product. These innovations lead to better and cheaper products for society. In this way, economists say that these inefficiencies are the price that consumers pay for new and improved products. But then it gets even more complicated, since other economists believe that product differentiation itself leads to inefficiencies, since there are often too many choices to choose from, and it's impossible for the consumer to have perfect information on them all. They think society would be better off with less choices. This just goes to show you how complicated economics really is in the real world, and nobody has all the answers. All right, to wrap things up, let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages of monopolistic competition. Let's start with the good stuff. First of all, there's product variety. Consumers have many different options and can choose exactly what fits their taste. Then there's ease of entry. Low barriers encourage entrepreneurship and new ideas. The threat of competition then encourages innovation. Firms constantly engage in non-price competition, like better service or unique features, to keep their market share. Now for the bad stuff. First, allocative inefficiency. Since price is greater than marginal cost, there is a welfare loss to society. Next, there's productive inefficiency. Firms do not produce at the minimum point of their AC curve, meaning they have excess capacity. There are economies of scale that are not being utilized, so the firm is not producing as efficiently as possible. Next are the high costs. Firms spend a lot of money on advertising and branding and research and development. These additional costs are usually passed on to the consumer in the form of higher prices. And that's going to be all. As you probably noticed, since monopolistic competition is a mix of monopoly and perfect competition, the advantages aren't quite as good, but the disadvantages aren't quite as bad as the two extremes. Monopolistic competition is like the best of both worlds. But of course, it's all about the balance between the power to be unique and the pressure to compete. Next time you're choosing between 5 different brands of sneakers, know you'll understand things a bit better. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.